Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Ubers Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And to the show, we're talking about how I haggled $116K off a house. That includes how Andrew haggled over $100,000 off a house, how much you can potentially negotiate off a house price when you go to buy one, and also how does it change between new builds and existing properties. And I'll tell you why this is interesting, because I recently got an email from a staff journalist saying, Ed, can you help me run some numbers about how low you can go when making an offer on a house? So I ran some numbers for her and it ended up getting published. I always like it when they use the photo of when I was skinnier.
You like that photo, don't you? That's what some of David's finest work.
Yeah, David, our photographer, mainly because that was back in the days when I was skinnier. And so what I did was I looked at 8,000 properties from that have been sold in Christchurch, Wellington, and Auckland over the last 3 months. So from the start of January through till today. So over 4,500 in Auckland, about 1,800 odd in Christchurch. And what I did was just look at those that have an asking price or had a price on it when it was advertised, right? So that was kind of half the properties in Wellington, just over half, just under half in Christchurch. Interestingly enough, less than 1 in 5 Auckland properties that were sold in the first 3 months of the year actually had a price attached to it.
That feels really low.
Well, just because in Auckland, like
Auctions.
over half of the properties tend to go to auction.
It's really interesting because an investor that I'm meeting with on Thursday, he is trying to sell a property at the moment and just wants a really, really quick sale because he's got another commitment. And as a result, he is willing to price quite aggressively. Now, his agent said, okay, we're going to go to auction. I didn't think that was a very wise decision right now in Auckland.
Why not?
Because I just didn't feel like there was enough momentum in the market to warrant it.
Yeah,
And it turns out I was right. It hasn't had anyone bid on it.
yeah. A lot of agents push for auctions.
Yeah.
Because then, even if there's only one buyer in the room, you can still sell at auction. It's just that you're trying to force that person to make a cash unconditional offer. You know, with
Get the deal done on the day.
which is obviously what real estate agents are incentivized to do, right? Like, if you're a real estate agent, you don't make more money by selling properties for 10% more. You make more money by selling
More properties.
10% more properties because the commission is higher within the first 400 odd grand. And when I ran those numbers for stuff, I found that actually the median property in Christchurch only sold for about 0.5% less than asking. In Wellington, it was about 0.4%, so not a hell of a lot. In Auckland, the median property or average property was only selling about 2.7% under asking. And so let me put that into context for you. Let's say that the median property in Auckland is listed for $1 million. Well, on average, it's only selling about $27,000 under asking. In Christchurch, it's closer to $5,000. Now, what's your take on that?
Given that we're in a market where it is a buyer's market right now, I would have expected there to be a larger discount or a larger discount asked by buyers. Maybe that just tells you that people are pricing really fairly at the moment. Like people's expectation as a seller is that I've got to be realistic to get a buyer right now, and agents are relaying that message, and so therefore they're pricing aggressively to begin with. Or one question I've got is, does that rely on the price not changing? So, okay, I list a property at $1 million, then I reduce it, or 1.1, then I reduce it to 1,050, then I reduce it to $1 million, and then there's a sale that takes place?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. So we get this data directly from real estate agents, and it's whatever the real estate agent put in as the listing price.
Okay, well, listing price would make me think that's the original listing. So therefore, if I've discounted from there, then that's the bottom price and the top price.
But then at the same time, the other thing I was thinking is, well, the agent is putting in list price, but there are a couple of different sales processes that you can use where you actually put a price on a property. So, for example, we've got asking price. So it might be asking price $1 million, but it could also be buyer's inquiry over $1 million, which would probably explain why that even once you start looking at the distribution of it, there are properties that, according to this data, sell like 15% above that list price.
Yes.
So I was like, okay, maybe it's not just that people are bad negotiators. Maybe that's what was causing this. Maybe it's that it's not just asking price. Sometimes you have buyer's inquiry over a certain amount. One other thing that's interesting before we get into your own haggling, Andrew, and negotiating up to 100 grand off a property, when we look at the data, there is this big spike across Auckland, Christchurch, and Wellington in terms of people negotiating, or a lot of properties selling about 1 to 2% under asking. So if we look at the people who are getting 10% off asking, there's not many of them, but there are heaps that are kind of just slightly under asking. What's your take on that?
Well, that makes me think that, again, the bulk of the market is pricing their properties correctly when they put them to the market.
Yeah, I think the other thing, probably my read on it, is that buyers want something.
Yeah.
You know, so if you list it for $1 million, you know a buyer's probably not going to want to pay $1 million.
No one in a buyer's market pays the value price, right?
But if you can get 20 grand off, that at least makes you feel like, okay,
I got a deal.
I got them down. One other thing that's interesting is when we look at if you're a really good negotiator, so let's say like the best 25% negotiators, how much are they getting off? So not the average person, but the top 25%.
Okay, let's say Chris Voss, who wrote, what was the book called?
Never Split the Difference.
Never Split the Difference. Is coming in. He's a great negotiator. What's he going to get off?
Okay, so if we look at not the average person, but the top 25% of negotiators, we're looking at about 2.5%, just under 2.5% in Christchurch. People are getting off about 3% in Wellington, but in Auckland up to 5% off.
Okay.
So again, if you think about that $1 million property that's listed for $1 million, maybe you're getting 52 grand off.
Yeah, I mean it's not huge. It's still not. I know 52 grand is a lot of money, but it's not insane. Like you're not so far out the field. It's not like it's a 30% discount, right?
Okay. Well, put your money where your mouth is. Now you've got to say what you're able to do, because all of these numbers we've been talking about are kind of open market, or negotiating on the negotiating something that is advertised on the market for sale. But I know that most of the stuff that you do is off market.
Yes.
So explain to us how that works.
So the way that works is we're working with developers, and so we go to a developer and say, okay, what kind of price are you thinking for this? What does it kind of look like? And then we'll look at not just what's on the market now, but what is there as far as a pipeline that's coming to the market in the next few while, and then kind of use that to negotiate. Now, one of the big things that I think is really important at the moment is substantiating a value with an actual independent valuation. So usually that would be a step in a process that a real estate agent, a general real estate agent wouldn't do that, right? They're not going to say, okay, the person wants $1 million. What does a valuer who's independent of this process say? Now, I do have to say, don't just think that because there's, in this instance that we're talking about, a massive discount. Like that is $116,000 is a huge discount of a property.
So this is your highlight reel,
right?
not your average.
Yeah. That is the highlight reel. But also, just remember, value is what someone's willing to pay for it. So I do think that sometimes a valuer might say, okay, well, in a normal market, this would achieve this amount. But there are instances where developers or sellers at the moment are so desperate, they have to get sales to pay back their finance, that they're willing to do deals that maybe they wouldn't normally do. And that might just be a limited number of properties. For example, let's say a developer had $10 million that they had to pay back to a development finance company, and the interest rate on that was like 15 or 20% because they were in default of their terms, right?
Yeah.
What they might do is they might say, right, we just need to seriously discount this property that's worth $850 in a normal market down to $750 just to get some pre-sales.
Okay, so you're saying that you are going to take advantage of these poor business people who are going through tough times and are being absolutely rinsed by the people who have lent them money, just so that you can get some investors a discount.
Yeah.
You greedy. You bad person. Naughty nickel.
Negotiating, Nickel.
Okay, so effectively what we're talking about is you've identified some, in this example with the $116,000 discount, you've identified some people who really need to get properties moved. And it's important to segue for a little bit and just say one of the things that we've started doing in our company, Opus Partners, because we do so much off-market, like we don't help people buy properties on Trade Me. We don't list properties on Trade Me. We help investors who come to us. And so what we've started doing is going out and getting a valuer to put a value on all of the properties before we recommend them to investors. So you actually know, well, what is this property worth? And we've probably been doing that for maybe 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, maybe a little bit longer.
And so what we then do is we push developers most of the time to sell those properties under valuation so that investors get a very good deal.
Well, I think the biggest thing in the market right now, like you said before, is people want to feel like they've got a deal, right? If you're buying today, you're still buying at a relatively high interest rate. You're going to be topping up the property if you're borrowing 100%, if you're using the no cash needed method. You want to feel like you're getting something in return for that added level of risk that you're taking right now.
And so I'll come back to the $100,000 haggle because I really want to get some more details off that. But as you said before, that's the kind of extreme example. If we look at the median kind of discount that we're getting at the moment, if the market is getting an average of about 0.5% in Christchurch, our median's about 3.6%. So I know with one property, it's a townhouse in Christchurch in a suburb called Waltham. The valuer, the registered valuation is about $605K. The price that our investors are getting is $26,000 or 4.3% under that, which is $579,000. So that's the average. Now, they're not all 3 or 4% under valuation. Some have no discount at all, but about half of the properties have some discount between $6,000 and $51,000. Now, let's dig into the $100,000 haggle. So, how did this actually work? Give us some details.
Well, I think in this instance, it wasn't so much that the developer wanted to accept this deal. It's just that they didn't really have much of a choice. Because at the moment, projects coming up to settlement. Again, if you've got, if you're a developer with development finance, it's not like a normal mortgage with the bank that you got 30 years to pay back that loan. You've got to pay that back at completion of the development. Now, again, depending on the level of debts that you've got, might be able to refinance things out. So I know there are a lot of developers at the moment that are sitting on completed properties because they've just refinanced it to a more normal credit facility and they're just paying the interest. They're renting those properties out or Airbnb the properties out and then servicing that debt. But for most developers, you've got a level of debt that you have to repay once that development's complete. And if it's complete and you've gone beyond your terms, the interest rate kind of goes up, like in some instances, double. So it's better for you economically just to take a lower price and get that lending repaid as quickly as possible, or run the risk of the finance company winding you up. So in this instance, it was a case of they desperately needed sales. The conversation with the developer and I was, what price will get 10 of these sold like that? And so I said, okay, well, I think that the fair market value is kind of around that 800,000. Make it 750. Make them so good that it's hard to say no to that.
Yeah, so that investors say, okay, I actually want that deal. How does that conversation go? Because surely they're like, okay, I'm going to take $100K bath on these properties.
It's a long, slow process. So normally that happens over the course of a year because the developer wants to see the market recover and sell at a more reasonable price for them. At this price, both the developer and the finance company are likely taking a hit on this. The finance company is probably not going to get all their money back, and the developer's definitely not going to make a profit. They're going to make a loss, so they're going to lose some of that capital that they've put in originally. But that is the risk of being a developer, right? That's the hard side of being a developer. And so normally, this would not be a conversation that would happen at the start of the project, at the middle of the project. It's when it gets to the end of the project, when they've kind of got their back against the wall. And I don't want it to sound like, you're taking advantage of a developer, because, we work in partnership with developers. And what it's come down to is, hey, this really has to be a no-brainer deal for an investor to pick up today. If you make the deal too good to say no to, that's how you're going to get the sales. Now, what will happen is they will get the minimum number of deals done to then satisfy their lender to give them a bit more time, and then they'll reset the price and probably put it up 50, 100 grand.
Okay, so that's kind of for off-market new builds, but I also wanted to dig into existing properties. So we've kind of got the broad market data to say, okay, maybe the discounts aren't that big. You know, you've given us some examples in off-market new build deals where the discounts might be 4%, sometimes, you know, in dollar terms up to over 100 grand. I also wanted to talk to some really good negotiators or property coaches who are out there all the time to say, okay, what do you see? So I called up Steve Goody. He runs, I think, Steve Goody Property Coaching, or is that what it's called? Let's go with that. And I said, okay, well, what do you see? And he said, well, it's pretty hard to put an exact figure on it for you. But what it usually comes down to is, what is the seller willing to accept? I.e., you know, how low mentally can they go, but also what can they accept? So, for instance, if you're buying a property off a homeowner and let's say the fair market value, if they didn't really need to sell it quickly, is $800K, well, if their mortgage is $700K, they probably can't accept any lower than that, even if they would be willing to, because they still need to pay back the bank. I said, okay, come on though, Steve, give us some numbers. And he said, well, you know, quite frequently I'll see properties that are listed for $800K and then nobody buys it. A couple of weeks later, all of a sudden they're advertised for $700K. And so, you know, around that $100K ballpark is what some people will see some of the time. Important to remember, whenever you hear us or any other people talking about property, often there is a tendency to use that higher side of the deals. You know, so we didn't call this podcast. The title's not going to be "I haggled $25,000 off a property."
$3 off.
You use the 0.4% off. You know, it's the big deals, the best deals that tend to get the most attention.
Yeah, and you got to be really careful in entering a market where you are going to see a lot more property coaches because the market is getting a bit more bubbly. You will start to see more of these extreme stories on Instagram. I had an investor the other day, and they said, "Oh, I saw that someone made few $100,000 on a property flip or something like that," which I think is great when that happens. But I'm telling you now, that is the rare deal as opposed to the normal deal. I think the other thing to remember is it really comes down to how motivated that seller is, because the only way that you're going to get a significant discount is if someone really has their back against the wall. There was a developer in Wellington that I heard about who they were selling properties way under what I think would be a fair market value. And the reason for that, I found out later, was because the couple were going through a divorce. And again, they had no choice. They had to offload those properties. They had to separate everything out for relationship property. And so as a result, some people got some really good deals.
But Andrew, the thing is, it's not just other people who use those bigger numbers. Like, everybody does that. And so the important thing, whenever you're watching a YouTube video or listening to a podcast, is if you hear about somebody who negotiated $100,000 off a deal, that, you know, don't think that that's going to be easily replicatable or replicable all of the time. You know, as I said before, the median on the market is something like a couple of percent. Even our median is like 4%. So it's not like 10% discounts are happening all of the time. It also depends on the time of the market. You know, if you're at a hot market, there ain't going to be any discount most of the time. You know, you're probably not going to be able to negotiate under value. So this can give you some idea, but it's not necessarily saying, well, this is the average experience when you invest in property. So that's how Andrew negotiated or haggled over $100K off a house. How much you can potentially negotiate off a house or a property when you're out in market, and how does that change between new builds and existing properties? Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.